The tall glass building of the city stood like a monument of power. Inside, everything shone: marble floors, golden lights, and endless movement of busy people. At the very top, in a wide office with leather chairs and giant windows, sat Mr. Richard Hale, the millionaire who believed nothing in life was greater than money. He had everything: cars, villas, expensive suits, and people who followed his orders without question. But one thing he did not have was patience or respect for those below him. To him, workers were just tools, invisible, unimportant. Every evening, when the noise of the office died down, one person always entered quietly. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor, the cleaner. She wore a plain uniform, carried a mop and bucket, and walked with tired steps. Her back was slightly bent with age, and her hands were rough from years of work. Yet her eyes were calm, and she worked as if she carried no complaints in her heart. But to Richard, she was nothing more than a shadow. He often mocked her presence. "Ah, the Queen of Dust has arrived," he said one evening, leaning back in his chair, laughing with two of his rich friends. The men chuckled. Eleanor only bent down to clean the corner, her face quiet. Richard threw a paper ball on the floor. "Miss Cleaner, you missed a spot," he smirked. She picked it up without a word, put it in her trash bag, and kept working. To the millionaire, it was just another joke. To Eleanor, it was just another night of silence. But what no one noticed was what she did after finishing her cleaning. When the office was empty and the city lights glittered like stars outside, Eleanor sat at one of the empty desks with a small notebook. From her pocket, she pulled out tiny pieces of paper. On each one, she wrote words: strange lines, almost like riddles, sometimes advice, sometimes warnings. One note read, "The tallest tower falls when the smallest stone is removed." Another, "A deal is won not by power, but by patience." She folded these notes carefully and slipped them into strange places: the edge of a drawer, the corner of a shelf, even inside the pages of an abandoned file. It was as if she wanted someone to find them, but not too easily. Nobody knew about this secret habit of hers. Nobody, except the silent walls of that building. The next morning, Richard walked into his office with his usual loud voice. "Coffee. Schedule. Hurry, people," he barked at his staff. He dropped his briefcase on the table, and as he opened it, a small piece of paper fluttered out. "What's this nonsense?" he muttered, picking it up. The words were simple: "Wealth is not money. It is timing." Richard laughed so loudly that even his assistant looked up in surprise. "Can you believe this? Some poet janitor is leaving me fortune cookie lines." He crumpled the note and tossed it into the bin. "Timing. Ha! Wealth is money, and only money." He thought nothing more of it. That evening, when Eleanor came again, Richard couldn't stop himself. "Tell me, Miss Cleaner, do you write bedtime stories for the trash can?" He chuckled at his own joke. His friends laughed too. Eleanor paused, her eyes on the floor. She did not answer, only kept sweeping. Richard shook his head, amused. To him, she was simply a tired old woman with silly habits. To his friends, she was just part of the background. But what none of them realized was that the first crack had already appeared. The note he had thrown away would soon prove itself true. That night, Eleanor placed another paper deep inside a file marked "Confidential Contracts." Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote, "Do not rush the gold that has not yet melted." She tucked it away, closed the file, and whispered softly, almost to herself, "Someday, he will understand." As she walked out of the building, the millionaire laughed loudly from his office. To him, life was a game he had already won. To Eleanor, life was a lesson he had yet to learn. And hidden between those walls, her secret notes waited patiently like silent seeds planted in the dark, waiting for their time to grow. The next few days passed in the same way. Richard Hale sat in his office, giving orders, shouting at employees, and laughing at his own cleverness. To him, success was loud, strong, and fast. But behind his back, in the silence of night, the cleaner's little papers began to multiply. Eleanor never spoke to anyone about them. Every evening, after finishing her cleaning, she would sit for a few quiet minutes with her old notebook. Her handwriting was small but firm. Each line she wrote carried a strange weight, as if her words came from scars that time had not healed. One night, she wrote, "A river does not fight the rock. It finds another way." Another night, she wrote, "The fool rushes for gold, the wise man waits for silver to shine." These words were not random. They sounded like lessons, like warnings. But why was a poor cleaner, mocked by her boss, leaving such words hidden inside his office? The mystery grew deeper when Richard's assistant, while searching through a file, found one of the notes tucked inside. She frowned, confused, and handed it to him. "Sir, this was inside the contract papers." Richard read it aloud, laughing, "The strongest lock breaks from the weakest key." He tossed it aside. "What rubbish! Who puts this poetry in my files?" His assistant hesitated. "Should I look into who's leaving them?" Richard smirked. "Don't bother. Probably the board cleaner. Let her play her little games. I like free comedy." But what Richard did not realize was that life was already preparing its own joke, one that would not make him laugh. 2 days later, Richard was in a high-stakes meeting with international investors. Everyone was eager to close the deal quickly. The investors were pressing him, wanting fast signatures and faster payments. Richard's pride pushed him to agree. After all, speed meant power, right? But then, as he opened the file to sign, a small folded note slipped out. He glanced at it and froze. "Do not rush the gold that has not yet melted." Richard almost laughed again, but something inside him whispered wait. He remembered the last note he had found about timing, the one he had thrown away. Strangely, that week, his company had faced a sudden market change, and if he had rushed into a smaller deal, he would have lost millions. For the first time, he did not throw the note away. He placed it carefully inside his pocket. Looking up at the investors, Richard forced a smile. "Gentlemen, I need more time to review these terms." The investors frowned, disappointed, but Richard stood firm. Hours later, news broke out that those investors were part of a fraud scheme. Several businessmen had already fallen into their trap. Richard sat alone in his office, the note in his hand. His heart raced. "This saved me," he whispered. For the first time, the millionaire began to wonder who was writing these words. The next evening, Eleanor entered quietly, as always. She swept the floor, wiped the desks, and carried her mop without a sound. Richard watched her this time. He noticed how carefully she worked, how she never complained even when he mocked her. When she placed her bucket near the window, Richard leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Tell me, Miss Cleaner, do you think your little notes are changing the world?" Eleanor paused, her eyes lowered. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she said softly. Richard chuckled. "Oh, come now. The wise river, the fool with the gold, do you think I don't notice? But she only gave him a tired smile and returned to sweeping. That silence unsettled him. For a man who had everything, being ignored by a cleaner felt strange. He wanted her to explain, but she would not. The days that followed were filled with more surprises. Richard began finding notes in unexpected places inside books, under papers, even hidden in the corner of his desk. One note read, "The tower built on pride has the weakest stones." Another, "Sometimes losing today means winning tomorrow." Richard laughed less now. Each time he read one, he felt uneasy. They weren't just random lines, they felt like warnings, written only for him. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. But as weeks passed, he realized something unsettling. Every note seemed to come true. A risky decision he delayed saved him from loss. A partnership he avoided saved him from betrayal. An investment he waited on turned into double profit. It was as if the notes carried a map of the future. Richard's pride was shaken. The same cleaner he mocked daily was leaving behind words that guided him better than any of his expensive advisors. And yet, she never asked for thanks. She never admitted they were hers. She just cleaned quietly, as though the words were not hers at all, but belonged to time itself. Late one night, Richard found another folded paper inside his desk drawer. His hand trembled as he opened it. The rich man laughs at the poor until he learns who is truly rich. This time, Richard did not laugh. He sat in silence, the note burning in his hand, as the city lights flickered outside his window. For the first time, the millionaire felt a question rising inside him, one he could not ignore. Who exactly was this cleaner? Richard Hale was not the kind of man who believed in mysteries. He believed in numbers, in contracts, in the sharp sound of coins falling into his accounts. Yet now, each time he opened a drawer or unfolded a file, his heart beat faster, not for money, but for another note. The notes had become part of his life. He never told his board members, never spoke to his assistants. To everyone else, Richard Hale was still the loud, confident millionaire. But in private, he was a man secretly chasing the words of a silent cleaner. One night, after the office had emptied, Richard stayed behind. He pretended to work late, but in truth, he wanted to see Eleanor at her strange habit. He dimmed the lights and watched quietly from his chair. Eleanor moved with her usual calm steps. She dusted the desks, arranged the chairs, wiped the glass windows until they shone. Then, when the building was silent, she sat at the edge of a small table. From her pocket, she pulled the tiny notebook. Her old pen scratched gently on paper. She tore the page, folded it, and slipped it under a folder. Richard's curiosity burned. What wisdom had she written tonight? When Eleanor walked out, Richard rushed to the folder and opened it. The note read, "A tree does not grow faster if you pull its branches. It grows when the roots are cared for." Richard sat back in his chair, stunned. The next morning, he remembered that his company's marketing team had been rushing into a huge campaign without proper planning. For the first time, Richard told them to slow down, to focus on building a stronger base first. Weeks later, the decision saved millions. It was undeniable now. These words carried truth. Slowly, Richard began to collect the notes. He kept them hidden inside his personal diary. Some were short, some longer. Greed blinds faster than darkness. Respect is the coin that never loses value. Even the strongest wall needs repair before it cracks. Each line seemed to whisper to him, guiding him away from pride and into patience. He started listening more in meetings. He paused before making rash decisions. He questioned his own arrogance. But the strangest change of all was not in his business, it was in himself. For the first time, he looked at Eleanor not as a cleaner, but as someone far greater. Yet, she still avoided his eyes, still worked without a sound, as if her notes were not hers at all. One evening, Richard could no longer resist. He called out while she swept the floor. "Tell me, Miss Eleanor, why do you write these things?" She looked up slowly. For a moment, her eyes carried a depth he had never noticed, tired yet wise, soft yet unbroken. "I don't write them for anyone," she replied gently. "They are just thoughts, left behind for whoever needs them." Richard leaned forward. "But they are not just thoughts. They have changed my life. They have saved my business." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then perhaps you needed them more than anyone else." She said no more and continued sweeping. Richard was left speechless. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor kept writing. Richard kept following. He began making profits greater than ever before, but this time, he knew it wasn't only his cleverness, it was her words. Yet a question kept haunting him. Who was she really? How could a simple cleaner hold so much wisdom, wisdom that no book or advisor had ever given him? Late one night, as he flipped through his secret collection of notes, he found one that shook him more than the others. The richest man is not the one who owns much, but the one who needs little. The line burned in his chest. For the first time, he questioned himself, not his money, not his success, but his emptiness. The turning point came during a major shareholders' meeting. Richard was under pressure to sign a risky international contract. Everyone urged him to agree. The numbers looked impressive, and the deal promised instant profit. But as Richard hesitated, he reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled edge of a note he had carried all week. He unfolded it under the table. "A fruit picked too early will taste bitter for a lifetime." He closed his eyes. His heart told him to walk away. And so he did. The board erupted with anger. Investors called him a coward. Newspapers mocked his hesitation. But weeks later, the deal collapsed, exposing corruption. Those who had rushed in lost everything. Richard Hale, the man once blinded by pride, stood untouched. And in his diary, he placed that note with trembling hands. That night, Richard waited as Eleanor entered with her mop. He stood up from his chair. For the first time, he did not mock her, did not laugh. Instead, he bowed his head slightly. "Thank you," he said softly. Eleanor paused, surprised, but said nothing. She simply continued her work. But Richard knew something had shifted. The silent wisdom of the cleaner was no longer just saving his money, it was reshaping his heart. And yet, one truth still remained hidden, waiting like a storm behind quiet clouds. Why did this cleaner, of all people, write such powerful words? The answer, when it came, would change everything Richard thought he knew. The office was silent. Midnight lights from the city glowed against the glass walls, throwing long shadows across the polished floor. Richard Hale sat in his chair, restless. For weeks he had been guided by the strange notes, and for weeks, Eleanor had stayed silent. He had grown richer, yes, but for the first time, wealth no longer felt like the prize. What haunted him now was the mystery of the woman who wrote those words. Who was she? How could she know so much about life, about business, about failure and success? Richard's curiosity had grown into obsession. He needed answers. One evening, he stayed behind again. He watched Eleanor as she worked. She moved quietly, carefully, like someone who belonged to the silence. When she finished cleaning, she sat down, as always, with her small notebook. But this night, her hands trembled. Her eyes grew wet. Richard saw her write, pause, and wipe away a tear before folding the note and slipping it under a book. Richard stepped forward, unable to hold back any more. "Eleanor," he said softly, "why do you cry while you write?" She froze, her back stiffening. Slowly, she turned, her old eyes meeting his. For the first time, she did not hide behind silence. "These words," she whispered, "they are not for you. They are for me. For the woman I once was." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed and sat down, the mop resting against the wall. Her voice was low but steady. "I was not always a cleaner," she said. "Once, I owned a company too. A company built with my own hands, with my own dreams. I had workers who trusted me, investors who believed in me. I was proud, perhaps too proud. I thought nothing could break me." Her voice shook. "But pride blinds, Mr. Hale. I trusted the wrong partners. They took my ideas, my wealth, and left me with nothing. One day I woke up, and everything I had built was gone. My house, my company, even my name in society." Richard stared at her, stunned. This quiet cleaner had once walked the very path he walked now. Eleanor looked down at her hands. "I fell hard. I had no strength to fight in court, no family to support me. All I had was my words. So I wrote them down, reminders, lessons, warnings. At first, I wrote them to keep myself alive. Then, I started leaving them behind. Maybe, I thought, if someone else found them, they wouldn't make the same mistakes." Her eyes glistened, but her voice held no bitterness, only sorrow and wisdom. Richard sat heavily in his chair. He thought of all the times he had laughed at her, mocked her, treated her as invisible. The shame burned inside him. "You lost everything," he murmured. "And yet, your words saved me." Eleanor gave a faint smile. "Perhaps that is what life wanted. My fall became your warning. My pain became your profit." Richard felt something shift in his chest. For years, he had believed money was the only measure of value. Yet here sat a woman who had nothing, and yet had given him more than all his wealth combined. He whispered, "I mocked you. I treated you like nothing." She shook her head gently. "Mockery cannot break someone who has already been broken, Mr. Hale. But kindness can heal." Richard's throat tightened. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not because of failure, but because of truth. Days passed after that night. Richard watched Eleanor with new eyes. He noticed her patience, her quiet dignity. He noticed how she never asked for more than her simple wage, never demanded recognition. Her strength was invisible, yet unshakable. Meanwhile, the notes kept guiding him. One read, "The man who fears losing respect will never lose money." Another, "The hand that lifts others is the hand that rises the highest." Richard began to see that Eleanor was not just giving him business advice, she was teaching him how to be human. One Friday evening, Richard stayed late again. Eleanor entered, as usual, with her mop and bucket. But this time, he did not stay silent. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I will never laugh at you again. You are wiser than anyone I have ever met." Eleanor paused, her eyes softening. She gave him a long, searching look, then nodded slowly. And for the first time, she said something that pierced his heart deeper than all her notes. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, "wealth without respect is poverty in disguise." Richard could not sleep that night. Her words echoed in his mind. He realized that all his riches, all his power, meant nothing if he could not respect those around him. The next morning, he made a decision. It was time to give back. The days that followed were different in Richard Hale's office. The same glass walls, the same golden lights, the same noise of phones and contracts, yet something inside Richard had changed. He no longer looked at Eleanor as a shadow in the corner. He no longer saw her as the queen of dust he once mocked. Now, every time she entered, he saw the quiet strength of a woman who had lost everything, yet still carried wisdom greater than all his wealth. Her notes had guided him to profit. Her story had humbled him. But he knew in his heart that he had done nothing in return. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Richard stayed behind again. Eleanor entered quietly with her mop, just as she always did. But this time, Richard did not wait. He stood up and walked toward her. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I owe you more than I can ever repay. Your words have saved me, not just in business but in life. You deserve more than silence, more than hidden notes." She looked at him calmly. "I do not write for reward, Mr. Hale. I write because words are all I have left." Richard shook his head. "No. You have much more left. You have wisdom that can build empires. And I want you to share it with me, with my company, with the world." Eleanor frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Richard said firmly, "I want you as my advisor. Not as my cleaner. From now on, you will have an office, a salary, and respect equal to mine. You will no longer sweep these floors, you will guide the people who walk on them." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. The mop trembled slightly in her hand. "You would give me that," she whispered. Richard nodded. "You have already given me more than money. You gave me wisdom. You gave me clarity. The least I can do is give you the respect you always deserved." Tears welled in her tired eyes. Slowly, she set the mop aside and sat down. "Respect," she murmured, almost to herself. "That is the one wealth I lost, and the one wealth I still desired." Richard leaned forward. "Then take it back. Not from me, from yourself. You are not just a cleaner. You are a teacher. A guide." The next day, the office buzzed with whispers. The millionaire had promoted the old cleaner to a position no one understood. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in his life, he was proud of something that wasn't money. Eleanor sat in a small new office, her notebook open, her pen steady. She no longer hid her notes in drawers or files. Now, she shared them directly with Richard, with his team, with anyone willing to listen. Her words became part of the company's heartbeat. Employees began quoting her lines in meetings. Decisions were made not just with numbers, but with thought and patience. Slowly, the company culture shifted from arrogance to wisdom, from greed to respect. And Richard? He no longer laughed at those he once called invisible. He greeted his staff with kindness. He listened more than he spoke. The millionaire who once mocked a cleaner had learned that true power came not from money, but from humility. One evening, weeks later, Richard entered Eleanor's new office. She was writing again, her pen moving gently across paper. When she saw him, she smiled softly. I have written my final note, she said. Richard raised his brows. Final? Why final? Because you no longer need secret notes, she replied. You have learned to see beyond money. You have learned respect. She folded the paper and handed it to him. With trembling fingers, Richard opened it. The words were simple, but they struck deeper than all the others. True wealth is not counted in coins or contracts. True wealth is respect. Without it, even a millionaire is poor. Richard's eyes grew misty. He held the note close to his chest. This is the greatest gift you've given me. Eleanor nodded. Then my work here is done. Not long after, Eleanor quietly resigned. She did not take the office, the salary, or the title Richard had offered. She returned to her simple life, her notebook still in her pocket, her words still flowing like a quiet river. Richard searched for her, but she never came back. She had left him with her wisdom, her final note, and a new way of seeing the world. Years later, Richard Hale became known not just as a wealthy man, but as a leader who treated his workers with dignity, who built his empire on respect. And whenever people asked him the secret of his success, he would smile and say only one thing. I was once taught by a cleaner whose notes made me richer than all the gold in the world.